Welcome everyone! Ever wonder if dragons really soared the skies, or if unicorns really had silver blood, or that howling during a full moon is a werewolf? Well, if you're like me, I've always been fascinated with such creatures. Join me now to learn the origins of these stories and many more in my series, Folklore, Legends, and Myths, Halloween Edition. If you're new here, welcome! Each week I create a new look using Color Street nail strips, and in this series, we're going to uncover these legends and find out why they still enchant us to this day. If you're interested in unique color combos and want to join us on this mythological journey, I would highly recommend that you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Vampire or vampire is a creature in popular legend, often fanged, that preys upon humans and generally consumes their blood. Vampires have been featured in folklore and fiction of various cultures for hundreds of years, predominantly in Europe, although belief in them has waned in modern times. It is difficult to pinpoint the distinct characteristics of vampires due to the long history of these walking corpses and blood-sucking ghouls in folklore. Central to vampire myth is the consumption of human blood or other bodily fluids or psychic energy, followed closely by the possession of sharp teeth or fangs with which to facilitate this task. In most depictions, vampires are undead and many said to rise nightly from their graves or coffins. Vampires are typically said to be of pale skin and range in appearance from grotesque to incredibly beautiful, depending on the tale. Another frequent cited physical characteristic is the inability to cast reflection or shadow, which often translates into the inability to be photographed or recorded on film. To become a vampire, there are various ways according to the legends, the most common of which is to be bitten by a vampire. Other methods include sorcery, contagion, or having a cat jump over a person's corpse. Some people believe that babies born with teeth or on Christmas are predisposed to becoming vampires. While vampires usually do not die of disease or other human afflictions, and they are indeed often said to have faster than normal healing capabilities, there are various methods for their destruction. The most popular of those include a wooden stake through the heart, fire, decapitation, and exposure to sunlight. Vampires are often depicted as being repelled by garlic, running water, or Christian emblems such as crucifixes and holy water. In some stories, vampires may enter a home only if they're invited, and that always made me feel a little better. So if you don't invite them in, they can't get you, right? In other stories, they may be distracted by scattering of objects such as seeds or grains, and then they're compelled to count them, thereby enabling the potential victims to escape. Creatures with vampiric characteristics have appeared at least as far back as ancient Greece, where stories were told of creatures that attacked people in their sleep and drained their bodily fluids. Tales of the walking corpses that drank blood of the living and spread plague flourished in medieval Europe in times of disease, and people lacking of modern understanding of infectious diseases came to believe that those who became vampires preyed first on their own families. Research from the 20th century and the 21st century have discovered the characteristics associated with vampires can be traced back to certain diseases, such as porphyria, which makes one sensitive to sunlight, tuberculosis, which causes wasting or severe weight loss, pellagra, a disease that thins the skin, and rabies, which can cause biting and general sensitivity that can lead to repulsion by light or garlic. Vampire myths were especially popular in Eastern Europe, and the word vampire mostly originates from that region. Digging up bodies of suspected vampires was practiced in many cultures throughout Europe, and it is thought that the natural characteristics of decomposition, such as receding gums and the appearance of growing hair and fingernails, reinforced the belief that corpse in fact continued some manner of life after death. Also, possibly contributing to these beliefs was the pronouncement of death for people who were not dead. Because of the constraints of medical diagnosis at the time, people who were very ill or sometimes even very drunk or in a coma or in shock were thought to be dead and later miraculously recovered, sometimes too late to prevent their burial. In the 19th century, bells tied to strings were put in the coffins before burial. And if a person in fact was buried alive, they could ring the bell. This leads to the phrase "saved by the bell" and "dead ringer." So that's a great idea. But what if someone wakes up in the middle of the night? They would have people stay in the graveyard all night just in case. Hence the phrase graveyard shift. Belief in vampires led to such rituals as staking corpses through the heart before they were buried. In some cultures, the dead were buried face down to prevent them from finding their way out of their graves. The modern incarnation of vampire myth seems to stem largely from Gothic European literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, about the time vampire hysteria had peaked in Europe. Vampiric figures appeared in 18th century poetry, such as Heinrich August Ossenfetter's Der Vampir in 1748, about a seemingly vampiric narrator who seduces an innocent maid. Vampire poems began appearing in English about the turn of the 19th century, such as John Stagg's The Vampire in 1810, and the first vampire story published in English is believed to be John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, about a mysterious aristocrat named Lord Ruthven who seduced young women only to drain their blood and disappear. Those works and others inspired material for the stage. Later important vampire stories, including the serial Varney the Vampire and the Feast of Blood, 1845-47, and The Mysterious Stranger in 1853, which is cited as possibly influence for Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Dracula is arguably the most important work of vampire fiction. Before we dive into the fictional tales of Dracula, including Bram Stoker's story, we can't go on without talking about Vlad the Impaler, believed to be the real Dracula. Vlad III, commonly known as Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula, he is often considered to be one of the most important rulers of Wallachian history and a national hero of Romania. Relations between Hungary and Vladislav later deteriorated, and in 1456, Vlad invaded Wallachia with the Hungarian support. He came into conflict with the Transylvanian Saxons who supported his opponents. Vlad plundered the Saxon villages, taking the captured people to Wallachia, where he impaled them. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II ordered Vlad to pay homage to him personally, but Vlad had the Sultan's two envoys captured and impaled. In February 1462, he attacked the Ottoman territory, massacring tens of thousands of Turks and Bulgarians. Vlad was held captured in the Visegrad from 1463 to 1475. During this period, anecdotes about his cruelty spread into Germany and in Italy. He was released at the request of Stephen III of Moldova. Hungarian and Moldovan troops helped him force out the new ruler of Wallachia. Vlad was then killed in battle before or around January 10th, 1477. Books describing Vlad's cruel acts were among the first bestsellers in the German-speaking territories. The Vampire Count Dracula. The tale of the Transylvanian Count who used supernatural abilities, including mind control and shape-shifting, to prey among innocent victims inspired countless works thereafter. Many popular vampire characteristics were solidified in this popular novel and established through its 1931 film adaptation starring Hungarian-born Bela Lugosi. The novel itself is thought by some to be inspired in part by the cruel acts of Prince Vlad III, Dracula of Transylvania, as we just learned his backstory, and Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or the Blood Countess, who was believed to have murdered dozens of young women in the 16th and 17th centuries in order to bathe in and possibly drink their blood as to preserve her youth. Bailey Sarian did an episode on her murder, mystery, and makeup series about the Blood Countess. Dracula in turn inspired the film Nosferatu, in which a vampire was first depicted as being vulnerable to sunlight. Other aspects of the movie, however, were so similar to Stoker's novel that his widow sued for copyright infringement, and many copies of the film were destroyed. For several decades, the vast majority of vampire fiction showed the influence of Dracula. In the 20th century, vampires began to turn from being depicted as animalistic creatures and instead displaying a broad range of human characteristics. Vampire fiction entered a new era with this sympathetic portrayal by Anne Rice in her novel Interview with a Vampire. Rice's book introduced the world of vampires, that they were self-loathing and squabbled like humans. Interview with a Vampire was highly popular and sparked a revival of vampire fiction that lasted into the 21st century. Vampire as misunderstood romantic heroes picked up steam in the later part of the 20th century, particularly in the United States. Vampire romances for teens gained popularity at the end of the 20th century with books such as The Vampire Diaries and The Twilight Saga. Another popular film series, Underworld, explored the ongoing war between vampires and werewolves. Although vampires had by the 20th century largely become creatures of fantasy, urban myths about vampires continue to persist. As late as the early 20th century, some villages in Bulgaria still practiced corpse impaling. And in the 1960s, a vampire was believed to haunt Highgate Cemetery in London. And still, here in the 21st century, rumors of vampires still are circling around. Thanks for hanging out with me today. What do you think? Do these creatures lurk in the shadows? We'll see you for the next one.